Thank you very much, Mr Gale. I'm very pleased to have secured this debate on pensioner poverty, although it is depressing that it is necessary. It's surely a scandal that in one of the world's most developed and prosperous nations, 1 in 5 elderly people still live below the breadline. That's more than 2 million individuals in our society. Today, I will discuss some of the causes of pensioner poverty and what more can be done to help one of the most vulnerable and deserving groups in society. 1.3 million UK pensioners rely on the state pension as their sole source of income. But at £97 a week, the state pension clearly isn't enough to achieve a standard of living that most people would find acceptable. Our state pension is among the lowest in the developed world. Among the 27 OECD countries, only Japan, Ireland and Mexico's state pensions are lower as a proportion of their national average wage. Had the link with earnings not been broken in the 1980s, the basic pension would be £40 a week higher. It's only fair that pensioners should share equally in the growing prosperity of the society which they helped to build. The government recognises that pensions must be relinked to earnings, but has not committed to do so until 2016. But even then, we will be left with a state pension system that, according to Ros Altman, the pensions expert and former advisor to Tony Blair, has described as one of the lowest and most complicated in the developed world. Women are hugely overrepresented amongst the poorest pensioners. Not only are they far less likely to have savings, but thousands do not even receive the full basic state pension. Even after the lowering of the threshold for national insurance contributions later this year, a quarter of women will still not qualify for a full basic state pension, mostly because of gaps in their NI contributions due to bringing up children. To make matters worse, with life expectancy for women exceeding men by more than 5 years, increasing numbers of women are left living alone. We should surely be working towards a fairer system, I hope the Minister will agree, in which any individual who has lived in this country their entire life is guaranteed at least the full basic state pension. I would also like to draw the Minister's attention to the outrageous amount of money that is going unclaimed by some of the UK's most vulnerable pensioners. One of the main reasons for the unacceptable level of pensioner poverty is the underclaiming of pension credit, housing and council tax benefits, which leaves up to £5 billion unclaimed every year, or £13.9 million every day. I'll certainly give way.
Very grateful to her so early in her remarks. Isn't a lot of the problem a sense of pride which many pensioners feel that they don't want to go and claim for means-tested benefits? They see that as some sort of personal failure, and shouldn't pensioners automatically receive a citizen's pension, which should take into account all of the benefits, including pensions credit, that they should be entitled to without having to go cap in hand to the state?
My honourable friend makes a very valid point about one of the reasons why many pensioners do not apply for a claim and therefore receive pension credit, and that is why I would like to see the basic state pension ultimately raised to such a level that the current system of pension credit just wouldn't be needed at all. However, as long as that pension credit system does exist, the government should at least ensure that pensioners are receiving all of the money to which they are entitled. The government's own figures show that this is not happening, and the number of eligible pensioners who are not receiving their full benefits is actually rising.
I'm following her remarks very closely. Could I just ask her to just clarify at this stage precisely what her party's current policy is about a citizen's pension? What level would it be fixed at, and how much extra would it cost over and above what's spent at the moment?
Well, the honourable gentleman, I'm sure, takes great interest in the policies of the Liberal Democrats, and no doubt will be interested in the comments of my honourable friend later on in this debate. It has been a Liberal Democrat Party policy at previous elections to introduce a full citizens' pension at the level of the minimum income guarantee. That is still an aspiration which we will work towards, but everybody knows that within these current straightened financial times, that is something which may not be currently immediately achievable. However, I think it is still important that we aim towards that, and I don't believe that the government has actually yet even accepted the principle that a citizen's pension is the way that our pension system should be going. And I think that, frankly, that is something that perhaps the Minister ought to be able to do today. The DWP's report on take-up of income-related benefits shows that 35% of people aged over 80 did not claim pension credit despite being eligible. What's more, the government's latest report shows the amount of unclaimed pension credit actually rose by 3% from 2006-07 to 2007-08. The fact that such enormous sums of money are not being claimed each year is indicative of a system that is simply too convoluted for many people to understand.
I'm very grateful to her. She's absolutely right to bring such an important matter before the House, before the House retires for an election. I think it's something that people will be looking at very carefully, and I congratulate her for bringing it to the House. Can she put some meat on the bones? Actually, 1 in 3 pensioners fail to claim their pensioner credit, and that is an average amount of £1,477 per year lost by those pensioners each year. And those pensioners are often the poorest people who are disadvantaged, and that is why this is so important.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman very much for that intervention. He is, of course, quite right. And, of course, by not claiming for pension credit, those very people also become ineligible for other benefits which they would otherwise be able to access, compounding the problem. Age Concern Scotland has described the system of calculations a pensioner has to go through to work out their pension credit entitlement as complex. The form needed to fill out a claim for pension credit is 18 pages long. And once the applicant has secured the guaranteed part of their pension credit, they're then eligible for full help with housing and council tax, but to get this they must fill out a separate form that is 40 pages long and takes 3 weeks to process. The government's proposals to pilot automatic payment of pension credit, which were set out during the passage of the Welfare Reform Bill, could begin to address this problem and I think are very important. I hope the Minister can tell us today when the secondary legislation will be introduced which will allow these pilots to go ahead. According to Age Concern and Help the Aged in Scotland, the DWP and HMRC already hold the information necessary for such a scheme to be implemented nationally. We should be aiming to provide simple and accessible methods of claiming for those elderly people in most need. The evidence I've outlined so far shows that the government is failing some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged pensioners on this count. The government knows that the state pension is too low and relies on benefits to provide pensioners with what the government itself considers to be a minimum living income. And so in light of this, I do think it would be fairer to aim towards moving away from this flawed system of benefits and claiming and increase the pension to a decent level which at least meets that minimum level of income.
She's putting out a case very clearly. Would she agree with me that it isn't just a question of complexity, although that is a real issue? It's also a problem that the incredibly long and complicated forms, as she's just very eloquently described, are perceived by many pensioners, including those in my own constituency of Westminster, as very demeaning. They feel that they are being obliged to parade their poverty in a way which is unnecessary and unfair, particularly when they have paid their contributions throughout their working lives and they don't feel they should be put through this. They would far rather, would you agree, go for a restoration of the earnings link at an earlier date. Would you agree that it's actually one of the worst outcomes? Wouldn't you agree it's one of the worst outcomes of the current financial crisis that the government's projected date of 2013 is now drifting backwards in time because of the tightness of the government's finances?
The Honourable Gentleman makes his point very well, similarly to that raised by my Honourable friend for Solihull, that many elderly people do indeed feel it's demeaning to go cap in hand to the government, and having a universal system would therefore be much better. And I certainly agree that the earnings link should be restored as a matter of priority. Certainly will.
I'm very grateful to her. It's an important debate, and she made a very important point about the fact that people do not claim the extra benefit means they don't qualify for other benefits. We're experiencing the coldest winter for many years. Many pensioners are cutting their heating bills, and in an area like mine, which is particularly cold, many of them don't get the cold weather payments because they don't qualify, having not applied for benefits to which they would otherwise automatically be entitled. Isn't it really time we gave the benefits to the people who need them without them having to claim them?
I very much thank my honourable friend friend for that intervention, and indeed he anticipates me and moves me seamlessly on to the part of my speech dealing with the issue of fuel poverty. Because the plight of the poorest pensioners has been worsened by rising fuel prices over recent years. Pensioners are more likely to be fuel poor than any other group and are also tragically the most vulnerable to the effects of the cold. Recent research commissioned by Age Concern and Help the Aged in Scotland showed that in the winter of 2009, a third of people over the age of 55 turned down their heating due to fears about their finances. And as my honourable friend has pointed out, we have just experienced one of the coldest winters for many years, and that surely, that statistic has to give us great cause for concern. Making that decision could have dire consequences for the health and well-being of the elderly poor. It's estimated that fuel poverty contributed to the deaths of 36,000 people last year. Last year, 2.7 million pensioner households, that's 1 in 3, were living in fuel poverty, and this year, with energy prices higher than ever and the prolonged cold weather forcing people to heat their homes for longer, the figures are bound to be worse still. Meanwhile, the government's measures to tackle fuel poverty are condemned as not fit for purpose by the IPPR report, The Long Cold Winter Beating Fuel Poverty. And as has been mentioned, eligibility for cold weather payments depends on having applied for pension credit, and so many of these go unclaimed. In my constituency of East Dunbartonshire alone, nearly 1,500 eligible pensioners have missed out on cold weather payments this winter. Energy companies have, on the whole, not reduced their tariffs in line with falling wholesale energy prices, allowing them to rake in record profits. The cheapest energy tariffs are often only available online to be paid by direct debit, which many older people are unable or unwilling to access. Many older people don't have a bank account but do use post office card accounts. And so I would suggest that extending these accounts to allow direct debit payments would not only support our post offices but would also enable pensioners to reduce their bills. It would be a welcome first step, but however, surely the cheapest energy should be available to pensioners with the lowest incomes in general terms in the form of social tariffs. The most sustainable and cost-effective way to tackle fuel poverty is to invest in energy efficiency measures and better insulation and heating systems in people's homes that will cut fuel bills for years to come. The Warm Front programme in England and the Energy Assistance Package, as it's now called in Scotland, could be very welcome interventions in this regard. However, many poor pensioners are still not being reached by these schemes, and there is scope for both to be radically expanded. I'm sure other honourable members will have the same experience as I have as a constituency MP, being incredibly frustrated by these schemes. The rules in Scotland certainly are that to be eligible for replacement central heating, the existing central heating must be broken beyond repair. At that point where the heating is broken beyond repair, because if you apply before then you certainly won't be eligible, then they will send out somebody within a couple of weeks to do an assessment visit, and then they will decide whether or not you are eligible, and then it might be some weeks or even months after that before they actually install new central heating. So if your central heating breaks beyond repair in November, then frankly this scheme is not much good. I'd like to turn to the issue of savings. Many pensioners on low incomes rely on the interest they earn from savings to keep them out of poverty. But with interest rates currently near zero, these people have seen their incomes decrease drastically over the past few years. Shockingly, the government currently takes no account of these lower interest rates when calculating how much council tax benefit or pension credit a person receives. Income from savings is assumed to be 0.2% per week, which currently bears no relation to reality and means that thousands of pensioners are having their incomes overestimated. I think it's hard to properly express the frustration out there felt among savers, and so I just wanted to share a few comments from some of my constituents. Mr. C says, I've just retired and plan to use the interest from my saving to live on. However, with the latest cut in the bank base rate, I will be struggling. Mrs. B says, so many pensioners and others rely on small amounts of interest on saving to make the difference between poverty and a reasonable existence. The government seems to be helping those groups who have failed in business and many people who have made no effort to live a responsible life, and is ignoring those who have made every effort possible. And I think that sums up the feeling of many people in this country frustrated at the problems that savers are now facing. Furthermore, the compulsory annuitisation of pension funds at the age of 75 is forcing struggling pensioners to accept far lower rates of annuity than they might receive if they could wait until the financial situation had improved. One 74-year-old constituent told me that he felt, having saved all his life, he was now being penalised by having to purchase an annuity at the worst possible time, and that his personal and private savings plan had been shot to pieces as a result. Indeed, retirees buying an annuity today are getting pension incomes of almost half the level of their counterparts back in 1994. Alternatively secured pensions, the only alternative to annuitisation, are highly taxed and can only be withdrawn at 70% of an annuity, making them not a financially viable option for the poorest. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury acknowledged in a letter to me that ASPs are not suitable for everyone and advised that people seek independent financial advice before taking one. This is a luxury many cannot afford. I can see no good reason to continue to require people to annuitise their pension savings at the age of 75. Turning to work, Mr Gale, a culture of inequity in the treatment of our aged, together with discriminatory government policy, has led to a troubled end to some elderly people's working lives. Research by the Third Age Employment Network before the recession showed that only 31% of over 50s made redundant succeed in getting a new job within 3 months. Only 32% of these managed to keep their formal level of pay, and on average they had to take a pay cut of more than a quarter. In the last year, long-term unemployment among men over 50 has doubled. This exit from the job market, coupled with the default retirement age, leaves some pensioners who have worked all of their lives in a desperate situation, being forced to retire earlier than they had planned or indeed can afford to. Government policy which disadvantages our elderly community in the workplace plays a major role in exacerbating pensioner poverty, not least that default retirement age of 65 for men and 60 for women.
Wouldn't she acknowledge that one of the major problems is that employers obsessively employ younger workers and don't recognise the value of older workers, particularly those from previous experience, and that there is anti-discrimination legislation, and she should at least acknowledge that?
I do welcome the Honourable Gentleman's intervention, and this is indeed part of the problem with the current legislation in terms of it not applying to older workers. But I do agree with his point very much that very often older workers in the workplace are undervalued, and in fact I think that a more flexible approach to retirement could actually benefit older workers and indeed employers by retaining older people in work, perhaps on a part-time basis and a sort of sliding scale towards retirement, so they're not facing a cliff edge, keeping their skills and experience in the workplace to pass on to younger workers as well. The Work and Pensions Committee was pretty damning in its 5th report, describing the default retirement age as discriminatory and unnecessary, and stated that they looked forward to it being abolished. It's still legal to force a worker aged 65 to retire against his will purely on the basis of age, and it's similarly legal to refuse employment on the same grounds. It's outrageous, Mr Gale, that only 1/3 of people retire voluntarily, while the rest face an often depressing end to a life of valuable contributions made to this country. The anger felt over this policy is reflected by the fact that almost 9 out of 10 people over 50 think the default retirement age is unfair. I do ask if the Minister will consider changing this draconian and wholly unfair law regarding older people's right to work, and it seems that the Equality Bill would be a good occasion in which to do that, although unfortunately, given the current discussions, it looks like the Government indeed does not plan to take that step.
At least acknowledge that we brought forward a review of the default retirement age, which was set when it was introduced to this year, that the call for evidence on that has now closed, and that we are considering that evidence even now. I would have thought that in the interest of fairness she should at least have acknowledged that. Clearly, Mr Gale, there's a great deal of support in general for the idea that we should end the cliff edge of retirement, and we are even, as she is speaking, examining the evidence that's coming from both employers and employees on this very important matter.
Swinson.
Well, the Minister clearly puts her points on the record. I would just say I don't think it's much consolation to those individuals in the job market currently who are facing this discrimination, being told to retire before they wish to do so. We do, of course, hope that as a result of the review that future people turning 65 will not be discriminated against in this way. And in fact, it's worth noting that when the Government was taken to court last October by Age Concern and Help the Aged over the compatibility of this policy with human rights legislation, it was indeed this promise promised review that was the reason by which the government were only allowed to uphold the law, with the judgment, Mr Justice Blake, saying, "I cannot presently see how 65 could remain as the default retirement age after the review." And I very much hope that that is not the case after the review, that it will change. I would just like to conclude, Mr Gale, because I know there are many honourable members here that are keen to speak, by saying that taken together, these pitiful state pension rights, the thousands of elderly people missing out on money that is rightfully theirs, concerns about heating homes in the winter and with savers being hit by the plummeting interest rates, it is no wonder that many pensioners feel abandoned by government. And I'd like to finish with the words of one of my constituents, Mrs M, who wrote to me and said, "Elderly people do not seem to have a voice." I hope that this debate today goes at least some way to providing that voice.
Yeah.